So we're trying, essentially, I hope that with these measures, we make the entire world a no-go map for Netanyahu, and actually not just Netanyahu, across Israeli soldiers and state actors that have committed these crimes and recorded themselves committing these crimes over the last 500 days. It's really only collective action that's ever broken the back of oppressive projects. You look at how South African apartheid regime fell, right? It began with the Lusaka Manifesto of 1969 that brought together African nations, that brought together actually African liberation movements. That was then a huge threat to the South African apartheid regime that was in place. And that isolation, we know, is what works, right? That isolation is what led to the end of impunity, which right now we're not seeing with Israel. It's a continuation of the impunity that it's enjoyed all the way from 1947. And so breaking those security contracts, breaking those security alliances with the Israeli Defense Forces, whether on technology, whether on exercises, whether on imports of specific parts, these are all threats and leverage that the Global South does have to continue to isolate and say, no, we will not touch the blood-stained Israeli defense industries. These institutions were never meant for us in the first place. They were only meant for us to be prosecuted in and persecuted in, not for us to be protagonists in. The International Criminal Court, especially in diplomatic circles and in personal conversations, would jokingly be referred to as the black man's court, because forever this is all we knew of the court, that it would be used against our leaders, so especially leaders that were working for liberation of countries in the Global South.
Hello, welcome to Expert Witness, a show on international law and policy. Our guest today is Varsha Gandikota-Nellutla, chair of the Hague Group. On 31st January 2025, representatives of 9 countries convened in The Hague, Netherlands, to declare a global alliance named the Hague Group to hold Israel accountable under international law.
We, the representatives from the governments of Belize, the plurinational state of Bolivia, the Republic of Colombia, the Republic of Cuba, the Republic of Honduras, Malaysia, the Republic of Namibia, the Republic of Senegal, and the Republic of South Africa in The Hague, Netherlands, on this, the 31st day of January 2025, inaugurate the Hague Group.
It was a historic precedent, marking the first such initiative since the Nakba and the establishment of Israel to coordinate state action to prevent violations of international law committed against the Palestinian people. Varsha, fantastic to have you in London. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sanders.
You're welcome. So today we're talking about the Hague Group, of which you're the acting chair or the current chair. Tell us about the story of the Hague Group. Who are the founding members? What motivated its establishment?
Yeah, so the Hague Group is born out of necessity. In a lot of interviews in the last few weeks now, when people have asked me why the Hague Group was born, I've given a funny answer of saying, actually, it shouldn't have been born. The international legal institutions that do exist, like the ICJ and the ICC, are international multilateral systems like the United Nations and the Security Council and the General Assembly. All of these institutions should have sufficed, and the legal obligations that each of the states in our world today have and owe both to the Palestinian people but also to the rights that are enshrined in the United Nations Charter should have all been sufficient to stop the genocide. But here we are, more than 500 days into a genocide going on, and we still see no end in sight. If anything, we see the ceasefire being relocated and the genocide being relocated. And we're meeting today, Sanders, at a day after when the Israeli tanks have been rolling into the West Bank. And we see, of course, the ceasefire once again having been violated, but openly broken. And so it's really from that necessity of seeing how on earth could we possibly break the material arteries of the genocidal machine is why the Hague Group was born. And that requires stopping arms, that requires our land and our factories in every single country not being used to strengthen Israel's economy and strengthen Israel's military, and it requires accountability. And once again, on the questions of accountability, we saw that what we thought was obvious, which is respect for something like an ICC warrant by member states, by Western states that have been pleading and really proposing these ideals of civilizational progress for so many years, openly, brazenly defy the orders of the court, making up rules as they go about immunity and impunity for certain heads of state, right? So it's really in that context of an open attack on everything we thought was sacred, everything we thought was obvious, is why these member nations have had to form the Hague Group to say we will not let our lands and our ports be used to kill our brothers and sisters in Palestine in a situation of completely unlawful occupation, not just of the genocide of the last 500 days, but really of the last many decades of Israel's unlawful occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories. So the Hague Group's founding members come from 3 continents, from Africa, from Latin America, and the Caribbean, and from Asia. And all 3 of them have committed to 3 specific measures. The first is to comply with the arrest warrants issued against Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant for war crimes, and in the case of state parties and in the case of non-state parties, still uphold their obligations as per the ICJ advisory opinion of July 2024 to cooperate at every level, national and international, to ensure accountability for all crimes committed. The second is to prevent the use of ports in any of these countries from carrying jet fuel and military supplies to Israel to be used against the Palestinian people. And the third is to prevent all transfers of arms and military supplies. This by no means is enough. We know that a lot more needs to be done, and measures need to be taken across a breadth of different levers to finally and ultimately end the Israeli occupation of Palestine for good. But we do believe we need to start with the concrete and do it in a collective manner, as opposed to fragmented measures from different countries, even champion countries, because only when we coordinate our measures across our different nations is when we might be able to break the links of the supply chain.
And in practice, practically speaking, how are these 9 nations going to implement the 3 commitments that you mentioned?
On the first, it really looks like doing the opposite of what some of the handful of European nations are doing, right? Which is, if Benjamin Netanyahu wants to come to speak at a conference in one of these countries, he will not be able to do that, unlike what he was able to do in Switzerland, or when Poland said he was, very welcome to come. When Hungary and France declared that, again, they would be welcome, he would not be greeted in government offices by presidents or prime ministers as the president of the United States greeted him in Washington, D.C. not so long ago, in any of these places, because they actually are respecting their commitments and obligations under the Rome Statute to the ICC, saying, yes, we will cooperate and not let, essentially a war criminal either enter our land or use our airspace or use our port space to be able to travel freely without any accountability. So those are the ways in which we see concrete measures coming in, but a lot of the others are already in practice. I mean, the question about ports and being able to transfer arms and jet fuel we're inspired by Colombia, who issued an energy embargo right at the beginning of the genocide, and knew that what was required was to break the economic might that underpinned the genocide, right? And make sure that their economies weren't the ones fueling the tanks that were bulldozing over the Palestinian people. And the same for Malaysia, which very early on said that its ports could not be used. So we're trying, essentially, I hope that with these measures, we make the entire world a no-go map for Netanyahu, and actually not just Netanyahu, across Israeli soldiers and state actors that have committed these crimes and recorded themselves committing these crimes over the last 500 days. And we're seeing cases and accountability coming for them now in domestic courts and in prosecution on domestic soil across the globe, because they've committed genocide against the Palestinians and are now going to vacation in Costa Rica and Brazil and Sri Lanka, and without any fear of persecution whatsoever. And that's something we certainly want to stop.
And why is it important to carry out this action collectively as the Hague Group instead of individually, as these states have done over the past year and a half?
Yeah. One is, we look at history. We know that in the face of the might of empire, if I may say so, it's really only collective action that's ever broken the back of oppressive projects. You look at how South African apartheid regime fell, right? It began with the Lusaka Manifesto of 1969 that brought together African nations, that brought together actually African liberation movements. That was then a huge threat to the South African apartheid regime that was in place. That then led us us to 1978, the World Conference Against Apartheid in Geneva, which took that spirit from the African liberation movements to the halls of the United Nations and called for the UN, which eventually did happen. We were successful at economic sanctions from the Security Council, which eventually is the last straw that broke the back of the South African apartheid regime and led to European nations, in fact, much of the Scandinavian countries, who were the ones with the greatest, strongest sanctions imposed against countries like Denmark and Norway, that imposed the greatest sanctions against the South African apartheid regime. And finally, you see all the way to something like 1985, the Special Conference on Apartheid in New Delhi, that then brought together from African liberation movements to the halls of the UN to all the countries of the Global South to be united in their response to why the apartheid simply had to fall. And that isolation, we know, is what works, right? That isolation is what led to the end of impunity, which right now we're not seeing with Israel. It's a continuation of the impunity that it's enjoyed all the way from 1947. And the second is really about punishment. We know that individual countries, especially a lot of small countries that are highly dependent on the global economy, that are often in other levers, not just in the question of geopolitical security interests, but on political economy questions, left at the behest of the whims of much stronger countries, and especially your poles of the world, if you may say so, and they are being punished. Look at what happens with a country like Spain, right? One of the friend of the United States, a friend of the European Union, and when they say they're not going to let their ports and vessels be used for arms transfers, they have an investigation open up immediately from the United States that could levy something like $2.3 million of fines per voyage on each of the ships that they block. That's a real threat. That's a real stick that's being wielded against Spain. Look at what happens with South Africa, when they brought, not just now with the Hague Group's move, but really a year ago when they brought their historic Genocide Convention case to the International Court of Justice, the United States, which is not even a named party in that case, immediately responds in the US House of Representatives by introducing a legislation to put all bilateral relations of the United States with South Africa under review because it dared to take Israel and implicitly its backer, the United States, to account and to simply to be accountable as per international law. So these threats we know are constantly wielded, and punishment comes down swiftly whenever you see, and especially a country from the Global South, act to hold one of the mightier countries accountable, and especially Israel accountable. And so then our only response has to be collective action, because at that point, if the punishment keeps coming down, then I think we'll find that the United States is going to isolate itself by punishing everybody when the rest of the world is on the side of the Hague Group and the US and Israel find themselves alone on the other side of history.
Yeah. And can you elaborate more on the idea of how the Hague Group is planning to interrupt the global supply chain for Israel's defense industries?
Sure. This is, the specific policies around this you'll find in different designs across the states. In South Africa's case, for example, a big debate is about coal, and rightfully so. It's been under pressure and being asked to stop its exports of coal, which is an active discussion in the South African cabinet and the South African government right now. In Colombia's case, once again, it was about energy exports and about stopping those. But across all of these countries, let me say a bit about a measure that isn't actually included, which is imports, and about security exchanges and military training with Israel that does exist. These are contracts that do exist with Israel across the globe, which is once again a symptom of the kind of global hegemony we see that Israel plays. And so breaking those security contracts, breaking those security alliances with the Israeli Defense Forces, whether on technology, whether on exercises, whether on imports of specific parts, these are all threats and leverage that the Global South does have to continue to isolate and say, no, we will not touch the blood-stained Israeli defense industries in order to ensure our own sovereignty at our country levels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Varsha, the founding members of the Hague Group are still 9 countries, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are you planning to rally other countries to join the Hague Group? Or are you expecting any countries from outside the 3 areas that you mentioned?
Mm-hmm.
For example, Arab countries, I haven't seen any Arab state there. I haven't seen Turkey, for example.
Yeah.
Spain or Ireland, for example. I know it's outside the three map areas that you focused on.
Yeah.
So, yeah, talk about that. Like, tell us
Sure.
what should we expect?
Sure. The attempt of the Hague Group with its launch with the 9 countries across the 3 continents was an attempt to demonstrate that collective action was possible, that coordination is possible across law, across economy, and across military. But that in no way is the end of what we think is possible with the Hague Group or what we think is possible with collective action. It's only the beginning. So the invitation from the founding members of the Hague Group and from the idea of the Hague Group is really to all nations to join and not just, again, commit to these 3 inaugural measures, but look at the various different levers available to us as states at the national level in order to coerce and force the Israeli government to stop doing what it's doing. And that comes from the simple recognition that calling on Israel to do something that we know it won't do, or demanding the United States to do something that it won't do, is not going to work. We have to stop the language of pleas and begging to simply come back with protagonism. We have to start doing as states at the national level in order to uphold the norms of international law and rule of justice at the international level. Certainly, we hope that the Hague Group will grow, not just across these 3 continents. Certainly not, because as you and I both know, actually stopping of export of arms across these 3 continents doesn't matter that much, because we know that most of the exports are coming from the UK, from Germany, of course, from the United States. So that's where we need to look when we think about transfer of arms. We also know that the Mediterranean ports are incredibly important for Israel when it tries to transfer its arms. So we know that those are the ports that really do need to stop. So of course we hope that European nations will join. And on accountability too, the ICC and the ICJ don't have any infrastructure of their own. It's not like they have patrol teams or police forces or jails or trial courts. None of this. What the ICC and the ICJ do is rely on their member nations to enforce their orders. But once you start seeing this kind of open defiance, as we have seen from countries like Hungary or Austria, that breaks that infrastructure down, right? So the only way to uphold that infrastructure once again and salvage this international legal institution, which currently I would say is completely under threat, especially with sanctions from the Trump administration signed by the executive order of February 6th, in order to be able to salvage it, we need every single country, of course, certainly in the Arab world, of course, certainly in Europe, but many other countries in the continents that I've mentioned. Here I can speak about my own country, India, which has certainly not played a role on the right side of history when it comes to the last 500 days of the genocide, which is quite tragic, because actually the Palestinian liberation and Indian independence were always seen as completely inextricably linked with each other. India becomes independent in 1948 at a time when, after 200 years of movement, where we've talked about Palestinian liberation being intertwined, we see the state of Israel being called into existence. And India's first prime minister votes against it, despite, by the way, being pleaded on by a letter by Albert Einstein, who, as you know, was called on to be the president of Israel, rejects it, so on and so forth, but writes a personal appeal to Jawaharlal Nehru at the time, asking him to vote in favor. And India at the time says simply no, because we recognize that we are not free until the Palestinians are not free. But fast forward 75 years, we find ourselves here in this situation where the current Indian government is selling technology, is buying technology, is selling arms, buying arms from Israel, and not just that, is sending its people. India currently for the last year has been sending its workers, poor workers who are hungry in our own country, to go and replace the Palestinian workers in Israeli industries for barely any wages, while an active genocide is still going on. So one call is, of course, to the nations that have been abetting this in the global north to stop doing so and finally walk the talk that they've been talking so far and stand up for international law. But the other is to set an example for our fellow countries in the global south that we know what this is like. In Malaysia under colonial rule, or Colombia under the counterinsurgency with the heavy arm of the United States, or South Africa under apartheid. When we look at the struggle for Palestinian liberation, it echoes dark chapters in our own country's histories. And so surely we as the Global South especially can have a collective approach and a collective action to break the genocide and the occupation.
Varsha, why is it significant for the Global South to be taking such initiative?
Yeah, I always think of this, the image that I saw when I walked into the Peace Palace in the Great Hall of the Peace Palace in The Hague, where the International Court of Justice is housed. And when you walk into the Great Hall, it's actually not a Great Hall at all. It's quite tiny, which is obviously the first surprise. But the second is it has these beautiful stained glass windows all around it. And when you look at the stained glass windows, I discovered that they were a donation from Andrew Carnegie, $1 million or $2 million worth, where they're supposed to display what's called the evolution of progress, right? And the evolution of legal progress, which is really about rule of law. When you dig into what this evolution of progress was, you find out that it's about the idea of rule of law coming from civilized Europe and civilized Western societies to the rest of the world, that in these stained glass windows are still stuck in primitivity. And my time of encountering these stained glass windows was as a part of the South Africa delegation when we brought the Genocide Convention case against Israel. And I remember looking at our side of the aisle, me and Indian, my fellow South Africans, and everyone else was helping us, and thinking, well, none of us can see ourselves in these stained glass windows, right? And if we do, then we have to see ourselves stuck in primitivity, apparently waiting for, Western societies to tell us about values of justice and liberation. So that was quite an odd moment. But then experiencing the incredible case and seeing the power of what it meant to speak truth in the world's top court, especially a truth that had been denied by the press, by Israeli state officials, by presidents of the United States that have been repeating lies and falsehoods, or we know to be falsehoods, from their seat in the White House, realize how incredibly powerful it is, and precisely why we were attracting the kind of reaction that we were, which is that these institutions were never meant for us in the first place. They were only meant for us to be prosecuted in and persecuted in, not for us to be protagonists in. The International Criminal Court, especially in diplomatic circles and in personal conversations, would jokingly be referred to as the black man's court, because forever this is all we knew of the court, that it would be used against our leaders, so especially leaders that were working for liberation of countries in the Global South. So that's, I think, really what is incredibly offensive to a great many people out there, political analysts and political leaders. The Global South has decided to subvert these institutions and has entered them and is now using it against them, which is quite a shock. And one of the ways in which you can see that is actually looking at the United States' reaction. They are very happy with the ICC when it's prosecuting people that they want prosecuted, as is the case with Congolese leaders, for example, on whose head, in fact, the United States put a reward amount after the ICC started going after him to say, if you have any information about this, the United States will pay you money to find out about the whereabouts. But when it comes to prosecuting its war crimes in Iraq, of course, you see sanctions. And now, once again, you see when you see Global South countries asking for accountability for its war crimes, and I would say it is United States war crimes in Gaza and in the occupied Palestinian territories, once again you see sanctions. So it's not really an objection to the institutions, it's an objection to the Global South using the institutions that should have been in only their control as they wield the vetoes in the Security Council, for example. They don't really care about the General Assembly because they know it doesn't have any power. But here, where institutions like the ICC do have any power, you immediately see them come down on it with full-blown sanctions. So part of our attempt here is not just to salvage these legal institutions as is, or save them and protect them, but really to enter them and reform them in the process of salvaging and saving them in this moment of real threat, where the US is taking a sledgehammer to all any semblance really of international order.
So, Varsha, for the Hague Group, what are your next steps? What do you expect any sort of future initiative coming up?
For the Hague Group, I would say we have three priorities. The first is accountability. just because we formed the group now, we don't think our job has stopped. Every member of this Hague Group does hold itself accountable. And in a way, the announcement of 31st January 2025 is powerful for that reason, right? Because we took what were essentially principal commitments made inside the United Nations, which we did. Actually, 124 nations already accepted the International Court of Justice's advisory opinion about the unlawful occupation of Palestine. And in September, accepted a list of obligations that states were bound by international law in response to the verdict that Israel's occupation is unlawful. Those states' obligations include doing everything in their power to ensure that Israel's occupation ends. And that includes the three measures we've listed, of course, here in the Hague Group's inaugural statement, but it includes a list of measures that go well beyond that, that look at disinvestment, that look at divestment, that look at stopping of imports, and of course, accountability at every level, national and international. So by bringing those principal commitments from within the halls of the United Nations to the announcement of the 31st January, I believe that what these nations have done is open themselves up to public accountability and a public audit, right? So that they're held true to their words and not just given a pass for having made a propaganda speech or a political speech that sounds really nice, but actually doesn't convert or transform into state policy. So that I think is quite powerful. The second is expansion. As you said, the Hague Group cannot stop here. It cannot stop it as a tricontinental bloc. We hope that it becomes something that engulfs the entire world, whether it extends to the Arab world or to Europe and to other nations within the three continents from which its founding members come. And the third is an expansion of the measures themselves. So we know that this is only the beginning, and to truly, truly cut every single link in the supply chain that goes to Israel, we need the commitments to be a much longer list, in short. And our hope is that we get there. The International Court of Justice and the UN resolution gives Israel 1 year time, which is until September of this year, to cease all settlement activity, to cease its genocidal actions, and to stop and to end really the Israeli occupation for good. So in that 1 year, we do hope that the Hague Group can, at the national level, enforce and implement every single one of these measures in order to stop Israel for good.
And the deadline for that is September 2025?
The September, according to the UN resolution, it's 1 year. Yes.
Oh wow, that's pretty soon.
So again, but it's a bad sign that we've seen a lot of countries pay no heed, right, or say one thing in certain halls and then openly defy it when it comes to accountability. But that warning only makes our task even more urgent and even more burning, because we realize that we have to try not just within these halls, whether it's a court or the multilateral institutions, but outside through collective action.
Varsha, many thanks for joining us today. I know you're extremely busy, so I appreciate you coming to our studio today.
And thank you very much for having me and for all the fantastic work you do here at Middle East Eye.
Thank you.